thanks so much. My name is Julio. Not sure if anyone has seen any of my presentations before. I do several things. I am a lecturer at the University of Saint Boniface in Manitoba, which is the Francophone university. I also work at the Manitoba Métis Federation, but what I'm presenting today has zero to do with any of these two employers of mine. I'm presenting something that is part of my engagement with Wa Ni Ska Tan, which is the um, Community and Research Alliance for Hydro Impacted Communities. I've been working with them for, let's say, at least 2 years. And this is some of the material or some of the, I would say, preliminary findings that I thought it would be interesting to present in this context, because it initially was not related to COVID, but as the pandemic and the socioeconomic situation which the pandemic generated evolved, some of the topics that I thought about in my research um, got together. So it's I kind of reformulated everything, and this is some of the things that perhaps we could discuss at the end of my presentation. So I'll just jump to the facts. Basically, I started working with Wa Ni Ska Tan again 2.5 years ago, specifically with one indigenous community here in Manitoba, Sagin, as they were approaching, or perhaps more accurately, they were approached by Manitoba Hydro, which I'm not sure how familiar we are. Like, do we have an international audience in here? I don't see. So anyway, just let me know if I'm saying obvious things, okay? Because I understand there are people from Manitoba, people from other parts of Canada, and people from all parts of the world, okay? So Manitoba Hydro is the Crown Corporation responsible for the production and distribution of electricity in Manitoba. It has a very complicated past with the Indigenous population in here. It traditionally has had a very strong colonial approach when it comes to, well, the most several issues that we can think about. Um, Although the company claims that in the recent years they have done, let us say, their due diligence in being more equitable with their so-called indigenous partners, what I'm working, and as you will see on this presentation, this, in my understanding, is still pretty much on a rhetorical level and not on the level of pragmatical sphere. So my first, this is to position it where my research starts. Okay, so that will give some idea of where what I'm working on right now. So basically, Manitoba Hydro, they made a proposition for Sagin, which is a community affected by the older dams of the company. These are dams which were built in the beginning of the 20th century on the Winnipeg River. They are not the biggest ones in terms of capacity, but the thing is, those agreements, they usually do a very long time, so 50 years, something like that. And they did one proposal, one half monetary proposal and have what I call non-monetary agreement, which means, you know, I'll be paying for infrastructural things and training and things like that. That's not exactly what I'm presenting today, but this particular community were in doubt whether the terms of these agreements were beneficial for them, and so they contacted Wa Ni Ska Tan, and Wa Ni Ska Tan, especially via Peter Kuczynski, he contacted me so we could do some economic analysis. I'm an economist by trade, but like I've always been involved and very excited to work on the domains of social justice and the most varied topics. So what I proposed by then was, let's see what exists in the rest of the world. And basically, the conclusion was that the proposal which was submitted by then was very, again, archaic, let us say. It does not align with what I call the best practices in the exploration of hydro resources, which basically we are more and more going towards a paradigm called revenue sharing, or the agreements of the partition of the benefits of that activity, because we know this activity is problematic in terms of its social environmental impact. So this was kind of the beginning of my research, right? So I was working with one specific community, and after I came with the conclusions from this research, I said, okay, like what if we revamp the entire system? You know, so what would it mean? What it would look like if we had a more equitable, let us call, governance system or administrative system when it comes to the the sharing what is considered the Manitoba oil, right, which is the biggest natural resource from the province, which is its hydroelectric capacity. So that's where I am, you know. So I'm particularly interested in understanding two things. Okay, so that's we're reaching this presentation, right? The first one is could we ameliorate somehow the flow of resources? Okay, so they're it's a crown corporation, right? So um, basically, Manitoba Hydro has I'm not going to say a lifelong, but it's pretty much that, a lifelong license coming from the province to use the entire water system in the province ever since the 60s, with the major diversion of northern rivers, basically the Churchill and Nelson system. The Lake Manitoba has been artificially subject to changes. Basically, it's a big reservoir nowadays. I'm pretty sure whoever is from Canada, you must be familiar with the drastic social impacts of this type of intervention. And anyways, this is one major area. There has been major floodings, erosion within the rivers, destruction of traditional livelihoods, etc. So this is one of the things that I wanted to talk. There, hydro is erroneously perceived as an environmental, non-harmful electric source. Of course, it has diminished levels of CO2 production. However, there are major impacts both in the local environment and the social tissue of areas that are affected. So this is something that both Wa Ni Ska Tan and several other organizations are very aware of. And because of this, I think that the whole infrastructure of the transfer of resources must be thought very accurately, right? So there is an entire discussion on this specific domain, which we call the royalties, right? So all, or let us say the majority of big tell me if I'm speaking things that are too obvious, okay? Because I know I don't know how familiar the audience is with all of this debate. So if I'm saying things that are too obvious, just send me a message or something, and I'll move on. All right, I'll just go from the basics. Especially because I have 1 hour to do so, right? So there royalties are a part of generally a financial compensation that one industry, such as one heavy impact industry, such as mining or oil exploration, oil and gas, or in this case hydro resources, uh, which this company pays for affected communities, or the political uh, entity which is responsible for the effect of these communities. The rationality of the royalties is double. The first one is there is a damage which is imposed in this region. Think about an hydro location. So basically your city will be flooded. You lose your pretty much everything, right? Your house, you need to change location. In many cases here in Manitoba, the locations are not fishable anymore. There are all sorts of impacts, right? There tends to be some temporal or unfortunately long-lasting contamination by heavy metals such as mercury. Anyways, so a part of this financial compensation comes for the direct impact that this activity generates. The second one is there needs to be some sort of let us say alternative, right? Because since this location has been deprived of some economic activities, royalties are also conceived strategically, right? So there is some resources. Think about a mine, right? A mine, it's a very good example. One day this mine will run off of its economic capacity, so this location needs to have the resources to rethink itself, to reinvest, to reimagine itself, etc. So what we have in Manitoba is neither of those, right? We have some sort of financial compensation for a direct impact, but not any sort of long-term strategy or long-term engagement between Manitoba Hydro, the province, and affected communities. This is particularly problematic because we are talking about very impoverished communities. Okay, so this is where things start to go together with the topic of our whole event, COVID. I'm talking income transfers, and I'm talking Indigenous poverty. So the first thing is, again, tell me if I'm just saying things that are too obvious, but yes, we are talking poverty, right? It's not that we are being somehow how can I say, we are exaggerating. Northern Manitoba faces indeed a strong issue with material hardship, um, nutritional insecurity, all things which again, if we have someone from our audience which is coming from other parts of the world and it's not familiar with the Canadian reality, it's poverty, right? That we're not being, we are talking with in many regards uh, some variables which are related to third world countries. They're including child poverty. Okay, so this seems to be particularly acute when we are talking about unreserved Indigenous peoples, right? So Manitoba is the province with the biggest share of Indigenous people in its demography. There is still a large percentage of Indigenous populations working, living on reserves, on both in the south but also in the north, which is, again, it's something. It's a region, especially the northern region, which is particularly important in the portfolio of Manitoba Hydro. So it would make a lot of sense if we had some sort of mechanism to, let us say, at least connect a major source of provincial revenue and development, such as Manitoba Hydro, and tackle what I understand it's the biggest social challenge of our province, which is the continuous and long-lasting poverty issues, especially in northern reserves. So what I'll be presenting here are a couple. I'll start my presentation with a couple statistics, a couple information on what I use to calculate things, because I am proposing also a couple of solutions. Okay, so basically here we have some evidence which were produced by recent reports from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. So as you can see, Manitoban Indigenous on reserve are like a discrete and a very visual locus, place of existence of poverty, not only in the province but also in Canada. And this is particularly problematic once we think that this also affects children, right? Uh, Again, uh, when we break down for vulnerable groups here in the province, so there, it's not saying that poverty is exclusively an issue of unreserved Indigenous people in here. It is not. We do have, for instance, uh, a big deal of poverty also on downtown Winnipeg, for instance. So we are talking about the rural environment, although the racial component maintains. It's heavily indigenized population, but we can see that clearly. Again, we have an issue which is geographically, culturally, and socially. Um, uh, we can identify that we are clearly talking about a situation which is another level, let us say, of the problem, right? So uh, child poverty under the Statistics Canada 2016 census, it's where on reserve, it's clearly where the majority of the problems are, right? um, I don't know if we should enter into some methodological debate. Like there are again several ways to define poverty. I don't want to give a lecture on this. It's just to show that again we it's hard, for instance, to compare Canada with the reality of other countries. Um, because there are several mechanisms, several ways to assess what poverty means. But I think it is pretty much, let us say, consolidated that by all standards, northern Manitoba and unreserved populations, they are deprived of several basic needs, right? So, which leads us to the main indicator which I have used in my calculations, which is the Canadian Community Well-being, the CWB. So the Canadian Well-being Index is it's a composite index which assesses three subvariables to assess the well-being of communities. It assesses employment and income, education, and health. Right. So it's pretty much I'm sorry, instead of housing, I'm sorry. So in a way it is one indicator which tends to be more accurate to understand again a qualitative dimension of deprivation, as opposed to, for instance, crude economic indicators such as GDP or etc. So the CWB has been used in the domains of native studies or in public policies for at least 40 years. The methodology started in the 80s, and technically, their new reports are produced every 5 years. So we can understand how each community. And another interesting thing about the CWB, I'm not sure if anyone has ever worked with this. It's calculated for all communities in the country, right? So we can see how not only how each of these communities has been evolving throughout time in this subcomponent, so education, housing, income, but also we can compare across different different types of communities. So it's discriminated by Indigenous, Inuit, and non-Indigenous communities. So I haven't have the charts in here, but it's obviously that when we get non-Indigenous communities, all of their well-being indicators fare way higher. Uh, talking in general terms, talking in terms of the entire country. But what seems to be problematic, there are two things which are problematic. As you can see here, there is systemic issue with being on the prairies, right? So Manitoba and Saskatchewan are particularly bad positioned. The our Indigenous communities are particularly bad positioned when it comes to Canadian the community well-being. And what's worse is that several of these locations, it's not that they're improving, they're going backwards, right? So uh, it's which is something very problematic, because it's no small amount of federal and provincial resources that are being funneled to these locations. But once you see that even with all these, financial resources, these localities are seeing their well-being being diminished, it's something that I think it's very problematic, right? So that's the main index, or that's the main evaluation that I'll be using on my calculations, right? So I'm concerned with well-being and its subcomponents, right? So a couple of things to consider, right? There has been some let us call academic or scholar reflections on what makes certain reserves or the certain locations thrive as opposed to other locations which either are stagnant or are lingering, right? So this is one of them, right? It's been produced by his name is Tom Flanagan. It's been produced by the for the Fraser Institute. I'm not entirely for their approach in the sense that they advocate that the reserves and bands adopt a way more stronger pro-market approach. And what I'm trying to show here is, at the other hand, they do a very good quantitative analysis. So I don't have any problem at all at using these resources. But I want to show, and I want to depart. Some of my conclusions will be different from their conclusions in the sense that we don't need to have such a strong focus on, let us call this, privatist model. So there could be ways to tackle and to address some of the most pressing socioeconomic problems on reserves, even on remote ones, which do not need major, let us call it, or wild, the adoption of wild capitalistic approach, right? So this is one of the first things that these reports show, and that I completely agree with. It is not a matter simply of remoteness, right? So what we have here is a regression between the remoteness index, that's for the entire country, right? Against improve in their well-being between 2001 and 2016. And we see that there is very low, or it's not very clear, right? If things were clear, so if the more remote the place is, the worse its well-being is, understanding that remote locations, they cannot share the benefits of called modernity or urbanity, etc. But this relation is very weak, right? So statistically, the R2 is one of the indicators of the fitness of a model. It goes from 0 to 1, where 1 is that's this variable is explaining 100% of these other variables. So the two of them are completely correlated. And 0 means that there is no correlation at all, right? So we see that in here it's 0.03. It's very hard. We are not seeing any type of direct correlation, or if we do, it's a very weak thing. So remoteness in itself is not something that justifies stagnation, right? Although, again, if once we control it by other variables, then we see it taking it here and there, right? Uh, However, being on the prairies is one thing that statistically has shown that it diminishes the well-being. This is discussed again in another report from Tom Flanagan, which the same way that he identified that reserves located in British Columbia, almost all of them had managed to make better, or what I called more modern agreements, revenue share agreements, economic development agreements. The inverse has occurred in the prairies, specifically in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, right? So there is an historical, let us call um, handicap, which has been ingrained in the political and economic apparatus here of the province, and that is again one more reason why we should revisit, revamp, and improve, modernize the methods of collaboration, of economic collaboration and sharing of the benefits of the use of land, right? Another thing which is advocated in these reports, and that I partially see the point. The report claims that the bigger the own source revenue from a reserve is, the bigger is its well-being. What do they mean by that? They mean basically that reserves which are, let us say, 100 or very, very dependent simply on the federal funds, they tend to score less in their well-being indicators, while as reserves which manage to have uh, bigger levels of autonomy in terms of the generation of the revenue, they tend to score higher. The problem is, once you think these two things together, is that it depends, right? It depends whether this reserve, this particular reserve, where it's located, of course. So when we think about some of the most, let's call it, economically well-performing reserves, most of them are located in Alberta, and basically they have signed deals of exploration of oil and gas, which is not the case in Manitoba. So what we see here is that Manitoba does not fare bad when it terms of finding own sources of revenue, and we'll see a little later what does that mean, which are those sources. But when it comes to exploring the natural resources, it's simply lower. There are several ways to explain this. Basically, when we're talking, especially when we're talking about communities in the north, they are located like geologically in the Canadian Shield. So there are restrictions when it comes to the exploration of the land for agricultural uses, also for mining uses. We are not seated in any close to any basin of oil and gas, etc. So this does pose as a problem, right? And again, it invites us to be creative, right? Luckily, if we can say so, uh, and as our previous provincial prime minister Salinger said, hydropower is Manitoba's oil, right? So all that the north lacks in terms of other resources, or let us call it other economically explorable resources, such as the ones in northern Ontario near the famous Ring of Fire, or those from Alberta, BC, etc. Manitoba does have its huge hydrological capacity, and it has been exploring this for more than 100 years, and it has expanded significantly towards the north, right? So I think it's kind of thinking strategically, right? So if this is the location where the biggest economic resource has been coming from, but it's also the location where the majority of our socioeconomic problems are located, right? And they are obviously correlated, as I wish to show, right? Basically, we can say that there has been no, let me say, consistent developmental strategy when it comes to the north, right? So it's a very extractive project. The dams, they have a high capacity, they generate lots of resources. These resources are brought by the transmission lines downwards. Some of it is exported to the US, but what is returned to these communities outside some, and this is not something that I'll explore in this presentation, it's something that I have presented before. So there are some sorts of agreements or contractual preferences which are given for local companies, etc., while the dams are built, or also for the maintenance with this. But this is by no means anything which is consistent and let's call it a state policy when it comes to securing development of these regions, right? So basically, we have the extraction of these resources. They go southward. Part of part of these resources are recollected in water rentals, which is the basically instrument which the province generates some revenue out of this. So Manitoba Hydro has to pay what's called the water rentals, which is the closest thing we would have for some type of royalties. And this enters the general budget of the province, which again gets dissipated all throughout the all sorts of expenses, right? So this is something that I see as problematic. Okay, but we'll get there. Of course, there's a lot of debate about the myth of the green energy. So the social environmental impacts of the activity are pretty high. Okay, so um, still thinking about hydro, right? So the first thing that I wanted to understand is, okay, do locations that are that received hydro money, do they score better when in terms of their well-being? And it's very inconclusive. Not to say no, not to say even it's negative. Okay, we'll see that later. Uh, but what it means is that Manitoba Hydro, throughout its history, with the support of the province, they have adopted an approach which is a case by case, right? So some locations have better deals than others. So there is no systemic, or let us call, there's no aggregated policy of fueling of channeling hydro resources revenues towards the reserves, right? So we have some locations which have a very big impact of hydro revenues in their band finances, and but the vast majority of them are not affected at all, right? So this is the type of thing that I'll be working on. What impacts the well-being of these communities? So if you're familiar, what I did is a multiple variable regression, which I added or took out several different variables to see what had statistic significance and what did not. So this is one example of something which we don't see a pattern, or we see a very weak pattern. This is something where we see a pattern. So that's what I in my calculations I called absenteeism. So reserves where the like the fewer the people stay in a reserve, the lower is the well-being of this location. Again, I'm only able to grasp correlation. I'm not saying which causes what, but in this case, it's something that they're mutually cause it. That's why I see. So there are no opportunities. So younger people leave. With younger people leaving, you have less people to work to make the reserve thrive, and then more people leave, the well-being does not advance, etc. So in here we see that in locations where there is a smaller share of exodus, right? So where more people stay, the well-being tends to be higher, right? But again, it's not something which we can say which causes what. All right. So that's what I told, right? This is from Tom Flanagan. All the locations which have registered a loss of well-being, and you see so many of them located on Manitoba. See, so even if we adopt a liberal, laissez-faire perspective of just let things go, and all of the province will catch up in terms of economic development, and we are seeing that some locations are going backwards in terms of their well-being, which is pretty sad, right? Which is the other way around. When we see the ones that are growing, the vast majority of them are outside the province. They're mainly in BC and in Alberta, right? So this is something which is very problematic, and which, in my understanding, urges for a revision of our mechanisms. Okay. So again, just to show how that's the gap between non-Indigenous and Indigenous communities, you can see that the gap is bigger in Manitoba than anywhere else in the country. Right. Okay. So a couple of things that we need to think about it. Right. So specific claims, right, which has been one source and one area of big political dispute. Uh, this report here, it's another report which shows no correlation between getting access to more land uh, in regards to increase in Canadian in the community well-being. So this idea that you can go to the courts and fight for land and this will bring well-being, there may be historical reasons for, and I'm not saying I'm also involved in a couple of these disputes, but what the evidence is showing is that lands in themselves do not bring well-being, do not bring development. Other things which are interesting is, like, even if there are sources of revenue, when they descend like manna from heaven, they do not seem to enhance Canadian well-being. I'm always saying things which come from evidence, right? So it's not that I'm being as technical as I can, right? So it's something else, right? When and that's one of the things that I put it into my presentation is income transfers, indigenous poverty, and meaningful occupations, and that's the third pillar of what I want to present, right? So simply the fact that, and I'm not saying that there needs to be a diminishing of resources going to unreserved population. Much on the contrary, right? So once we see the issue of poverty, it's not a simply issue of remanaging resources. No, there needs to be, uh, uh, an increase in the overhead resources going to tackle the most pressing things of poverty. But development, and if we think more refined versions of well-being, it's not simply about sending money. There needs to be something else, and that's to show that there has been no lack of, or I mean, there has been no, at least, effort to augment the flow of resources going to unreserved people. But so what's going on, right? So that's when I do my own regressions, right? That's what I did with my own. All of these that I've presented so far is evidence from the entire country, the reserves from the entire country. So I took the 63 reserves from Manitoba, and I said, okay, let's see what we can grasp here in terms of data and etc. So since reserves are the bands are required by law through the Transparency Act, First Nation Transparency Act, to publish their financial material. I've collected this from the last 5 years for each of the 63 bands, and I did a couple cleaning of the table, and I wanted to see what was effective and what was not effective to justify higher or lower levels of well-being. Okay, so some of the, again, this is it's I'm not saying that this will explain everything. There are several statistic you know uh, technicalities which I'm more than happy to hear comments if anyone has this background. But I did a couple different models, 1 to 8, where I've added or took different variables. Generally, my R2, which is again the fitness of my model, is between 2/3 and 75, a little more. So it's saying that these variables, they're explaining the majority of the variations in well-being, right? So some things which I can see. The first one is three variables have been consistently. So we can, once we make the regressions, we can say that something is correlated at 10%, 5%, or 1% of how do you call it? Of precision, right? You can affirm, or you can deny an hypothesis at 90%, 95%, 99%. So some variables there have been consistently significative negatively, right? So these are the three things which are consistently negatively impacted with well-beings of communities. The first one is the bigger the share of governmental transfer in the individual level, right? So the more a person relies on uh, simply governmental transfer, the lower the well-being of that community, which makes sense, right? This is probably someone who literally has found no other opportunity, and probably it's living basically on uh, federal transfers, right? The second one, which is again, I've mentioned already, the absence, right? So communities where the majority of people went away are also consistently the ones with lower levels of well-being. And the third one, which is very interesting, is the bigger the money coming from hydro, the negative the well-being. How do I understand this? I understand this in the following way. These are the locations where hydro is most present. So basically, it's where their operations are. It's where they're putting money, where their dams and their lines are. So, and as we've seen, uh, hydro impact is very, very negative, and we are seeing this statistically. So this is kind of a that's kind of a something to think about, right? So the bigger the hydro money is entering, the less happy this community is. So we must think exactly why, right? So these are on the other hand, the variables which have had positive relation, but they are not as consistent as these three ones. So some reserves, they've made something which is called a land agreement deal. Uh, these have been consistently positive, or relatively consistently positive. Whoever signed a land agreement deal has experienced a better well-being. The same goes with membership to the First Nation Financial Authority. Probably this may relate to having access to more streams of resources in terms of housing, or I'm not sure. And the third one, which is something that I want to work with, is economic complexity, right? So those locations which manage to develop a more complex economic structure tend to score better in their well-being. I want to talk a lot about this because it has a lot to do with the meaningful occupation part of my presentation. Per capita revenue band, there has been some relatively consistent. So yes, money matters, right? Money does matter. Generating more money does impact uh, the well-being of the location. Remoteness, as I said, has been registered in only a couple or just one model, so it's not an issue. And all these are all of the variables which I have identified no statistic effect. So distance to Winnipeg, not an issue. Population, not an issue. The current revenue, so if you're making 10 million per year or 3 million per year, not an issue. That's an interesting one. We hear a lot, oh, chief and council, they're getting the money of our band. So I see, what was the share of chief and council salaries in well-being? Not an issue. In absolute terms, not an issue. What's the share of hydro in percentage, right? So not an issue. Chief salary on itself, not an issue. Or when I say not an issue, is that the models, like, they didn't capture any statistic significance. And the same thing as to people making their own money, right, as opposed to having transferred from the government. So some very foods for thoughts, right? So I'm uh, I'm going to towards the end of my presentations. These are some of the things. So we need to find a better way to flow resources, because money matters, but it needs to be something better, right? So one of the things is blocking water rentals. Okay, so as I said, water rentals, it's something that which is going to the province, and then the province distributes it as they want it. I say, why, right? Why don't we make these resources stay where they are most needed, right? So this is something which that's interesting, right? The yellow, the, the light blue ones is how much water rentals the province has collected from Manitoba Hydro. The yellow one is a projection from Manitoba Hydro, where they say, why are you assuming that this money should be diminished, while I think that it should be increased, especially if we block these resources to tackle poverty, right? So this is my proposal number one. Proposal number two, we need to stop fracking. We need to stop breaking communities apart, in the sense that, stop fostering Manitoba Hydro doing one-on-one agreements. Between 1999 and 2010, there has been agreements with 18 communities. This is very stressful. This is very costful. This is very unequal and unfair in the sense that Manitoba Hydro has a team of 10 lawyers, while what is the juridical capacity of those small communities? How are they going to do a good deal if they don't have the proper so there's a lot of unfairness in there. That's why I would advocate for a one solution which covers the all affected locations, right? Why I'm saying it's unequal, that's what I'm talking about, right? So we have locations which manage to receive like a big money, or and others which are very very small amounts. So that that's something that I think we should fight against. All right. So these are some of the conclusions of my model. So that's how things are currently. Hydro impact. Each X is one reserve, right? It's one band. So we see that some very small, a couple places received financial resources, but as I shown, the impact is negatively correlated. Basically, these are the places which basically are taking the shot, are receiving the impact, the direct and negative impact of Manitoba Hydro, and at the same time they are receiving some money. So what I'm saying is, let's do it different. Let's take the water rentals, which at this moment are going to the province, and let's make this resource stay or be distributed through the communities. That's the change we would have if we alter this model. So currently, uh, 2.4% of the resources from the reserves come from Manitoba Hydro. With my models, that would go to around 11%. We would increase the average coming from 3 million to around 17 million. All of other things, how many recipients, we would kind of double the number of recipients, either directly, so people living on the reserve, or indirectly, people that are registered as members of that reserve. What else? The average resource which would be going to the direct population, it would be increased. So there are a couple. The difference between this model number 2 and model number 3 is this one we would simply divide it by population. So it would be proportional to population, and in this one here we would have a flat contribution going to each and every reserve in Manitoba. So let's share hydro resources equally between all reservists, even those that have zero to do with hydro, right? Because we understand that this is a richness that we have in the province, and that it should go to the people most in need, right? Okay. What's the meaning of those values? I'm going to the end of my presentation. That's for Seguin, right? That's the latest proposal from Manitoba Hydro. They offered 40 million for I think for 30 more years of exploration of the Winnipeg River. That sounds a lot, but if you make the calculations for all other sources of revenue from, and this is Seguin is representative in the sense that it's not different from any other, or from the majority of other locations. So what Manitoba Hydro was offering was less than the revenue collected by the community bingo, right? So which is, or the VOT, not to say the superstore. So on per month, on average, Manitoba Hydro would be contributing to $10 for each habitant of Seguin, while the community bingo contributed with 16. So when I talked to my colleagues and friends from Seguin, is that if Manitoba Hydro simply bought someone more bingo tickets, it would be doing more for the economy than what they were proposing, right? Uh, okay, so another thing is, okay, so but aren't we going to collapse the provincial budget if we take the water rentals off the provincial budget and allocate it to the communities? And that's how much the water rentals represent in terms of the provincial sources of revenue. It's 0.69. So I haven't even made the calculations if we try to augment this value, but this is very low, very low. Like there are several other sources of revenue which are profoundly more important than water rentals. So if water is Manitoba's oil, who's gaining with it? Of course, the electricity rate is small comparatively, but at the same time, we are facing very strong things regarding to poverty, right? Okay, the other thing is, okay, let's do nothing. So this is a couple values to show what's the cost of do nothing, right? If you have one single person which contracts diabetes and has to be treated publicly, that's how much it would cost for the province. If we have one youth, you know, since we are not offering proper solutions to socioeconomic problem, that's the cost of having one youth in custody, and that's even bigger if we have one adult in custody. So I think that that these are, you know, we are always kind of we always fear talking about big values, but you know the cost of not doing nothing is also enormous. Right. So this is how things start to be interesting, and why I start to depart from from these other colleagues from the Fraser Institute. I've seen, okay, is it a matter of complexity? Because we've seen that complexity is, where is it? Sorry. Yeah, complexity, economic complexity means, you know, how I assess this. I took the financial documents, and I've seen all subsidiaries, you know, so um, all sorts of things that these bands have, which can go from a housing authority, a healthcare center, a school, an ELS, early childhood education center, trust, a gas store, a complex center, a mine, anything, right? And I said, okay, um, all of those things together, they are important for, or they have been statistically significant for the well-being of the communities. But then I decided to see, oh, is it simply a matter of the activities which make money? So I took off the first two tiers, which I call the with the ones with least economic impact. So administration, and you know, trusts and business accounts, things like that. And I said, okay, let's just take a look at what, you know, if it's a matter of making money, right? So having casinos, having mines, having, you know, lodges, marines, things like that. And the answer is no, right? Well-being is related to complexity, but it's not related to profitability, right? So that's where we get the topic of meaningful occupation, right? It's more, what I'm advocating. It's more about finding meaningful reasons and meaningful occupations for people than making profit. You know, profit's not necessarily something which brings well-being to these communities. Okay, so that's what I mean by complexity, right? So how many subsidiaries each band had. So we had some which are very complex, uh, like this is the ones from Chimawin, Depa, right? So with they own a casino jointly. We have Nelson House, but as you can see, complexity on the parentheses, you see their well-being. So we have places with a very relatively small complexity, but they manage to score well. We have places with some complexity, etc. So and in the colors, that's what I've mentioned, the economic impact, which is again not statistically relevant. So it's more important to have complexity, to have people occupied, also, or I would say predominantly in administration, in things about the life of the location and, you know, the functioning of the reserve, rather than making money. Of course, as I said, making money is also important, right? So that's a couple things. And to finalize, I enter on the topic of universal basic income, right? Which is something which has a lot to do and has come along very strongly in the recent months because of COVID, right? Uh, Income transfer, I think we really should start thinking in adopting a universal basic income modality, also to make advance the meaningful occupation, right? So what I'm calling proposal number 3 is all of the above plus UBI. So I'm not. I think that universal basic income is something that should not come specifically or uniquely for indigenous communities in the north. It's something that, again, it should be universal. Luckily, and this is something I'm very open to discuss with whoever wants. I'm not alone on this debate. I've recently published a paper on how universal basic income needs to talk with local policies. There is a very celebrated tradition of universal basic income here in Manitoba, which stems from Professor Evelyn Forget from the University of Manitoba, and there are all sorts of out of the box ideas, such as aligning digital economy with universal basic income. So yeah, that's the conclusion of my presentation. I hope I didn't take too much time. It is, again, something which has to do with eradicating poverty, ameliorating the flow of resources, being more equitable with the sharing of the most precious resource in Manitoba, and let us be honest, in the world, which is water, but also discussing the debate of meaningful occupations and what makes sense for the well-being of Indigenous people. Oh, let's do the following. If anyone wants to talk with me, you have my email, and we can arrange a talk, okay? And we can discuss any other specific things you may have in mind.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
If anyone is interested in learning more about Wa Ni Ska Tan, like there's a website and there's a lot of people, great people that work on that project.
Yeah,
so
I can also post their website. I'm very happy because it was their resources which also allowed me to do this research. So yeah, hydroimpact.ca.
Thank you so much.
Thank
and
you.
Thanks everyone for being here and
Thank you.
Your questions, everything. And Julio, of course. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah. Okay. Have a good afternoon, everyone.